Hi, everyone. Welcome to 21st Century Saints. It's great to be back with you in the studio again. Aren't we being so well behaved this year that we've managed to do our weekly podcast this year 3 weeks in a row like we normally used to? It's great to be able to just share this space with you all, and it's great that life has calmed down enough to allow us to do that. Thank you all so much to those of you who have been reaching out over the past few weeks about our new document, our safeguarding booklet. We're excited to be able to tell you that so many people have requested their copies. We've been sending PDF copies of the document all over the world. We've been getting them in the post, and they're in the hands of some members of Parliament, some members of the Scottish Parliament, and we're just really excited that we've been able to have some powerful conversations, and we'll share news about that in a future episode that is not too far away. You're all here tonight for one reason only, and it is not Sarah and I. We have been last week. We told you, so I want to just not to. This is not bigging our guest up. This is putting our guest in perspective. When I think of the heroes of the Mormon milieu, I think Chico, Queen Chico, I think Carolyn Pearson, and my third of my holy trilogy is Laurie Lee Hall. And I know so many people share that love for Laurie Lee, for her story, for her journey, for her experiences, for the service that she has rendered to so many, and now this incredible book. So first of all, I have my wonderful co-host here with us in the studio tonight. Sarah, do you want to say hey?
Hey everyone, good to be here. And as Jane said, I would reiterate the excitement about being able to chat with Laurie Lee. We met once years ago at Affirmation in Brighton, and it's just really, really good to get an opportunity to talk again. It really is. So it's going to be a good session. We're going to learn a lot. We're going to understand a lot, and hopefully we're going to be able to come together to be more supportive of our trans brothers and sisters.
I know that our friend Beyond Belief, our friend BB, is reflecting so many comments from people who met Laurie Lee when she took that trip in the past few years over to the United Kingdom, and who remember her so warmly and were so impacted by meeting her. So with that, let's introduce Laurie Lee Hall. Welcome to the studio. It's great to have you with us.
I'm so excited to be back in the UK.
Exactly. It's so great that you're here with us in spirit. Could I just get you, for those people who've been living under a rock, would you share a little bit about your background and your relationship to Mormonism?
Right. Well, there was a time when I was as far in as anybody. I joined the church while I was studying architecture at Rensselaer Polytechnic in New York. And I literally immersed myself deep within Mormonism because, in part, I really, really loved it. But I loved the pathway it taught. But I was also clinging to this idea of being a priesthood holder and following a pathway that would help me to successfully live as a male, because I had committed myself just before attending university that I could no longer consider myself female, and I had to figure out how to live as an adult male. And the church just provided such a wonderful pathway to make that happen successfully. And I tell about this in the book that I, in short time, managed to receive all of the benefits of being a priesthood holder and a priesthood leader and an elders quorum president and a bishop and a stake president, and then to go to work for the church as an architect and ultimately become the chief architect for the church over temples and other special projects. It was the ultimate Mormon guy life if you're trained as an architect. It was all there. And I can't think of, any success that I didn't enjoy by the time I realized I was really transgender and I needed to deal with my authenticity. And ultimately, to make it really, really short so that we can get into questions later and dialogue, I lost my employment with the church over my transition. 9 months later, I lost my membership in the church due to my social transition. I wound up not being able to practice my craft in Salt Lake and in Utah because of the prejudice against who I had become. And now I've written a book that tells really as fairly and as succinctly as I can with integrity how all that happened.
We always joke amongst the British podcasters, joking but not joking, how to make it all about me. So just to make it all about me for a second, as a nuanced member of the church for many years, also a convert, I remember the feeling of hearing, here's Laurie Lee Hall, and she was an architect for temples. She was this incredible woman, and I thought, oh my goodness, as a member of the church, for a member of the church to be at that level, and she's trans, and what beautiful hope I have for the future of the church. Oh wait, oh, she's not a member anymore. That wasn't okay. And I feel like when we still talk about you, which we talk about you actually in our home very frequently. We have an intersection of my husband has an architectural background. He's in the construction industry, and so there's this I feel like he speaks a different language when he's talking about work. It's very, very masculine, very the tone, and if there's any sort of disagreements, it gets very alpha male. And we have a transgender child, and so we talk about these wonderful possibilities. Was there a time when you had hope that you would be able to stay in the church, or do you feel that when you were able to choose to live in alignment with your identity, did you have to make the call, I guess is what I'm asking? Did you have to make a decision? Did you know this is going to be it?
That evolved over time. I was naive and hopeful. It looks like it was naive looking back, considering what happened, but I was at least hopeful that if anyone could help the leaders of the church understand what it meant to have gender dysphoria and how appropriate and valuable it is to support an individual in that circumstance and provide accommodation, I thought if anyone could tell that story and help change policy and move it towards a more merciful and compassionate attitude towards transgender people, I felt it was me. I describe in the book how I felt like Esther going before the king to try to save all her people. And I felt like I had been brought to the kingdom for such a time as this, as I describe in the book. I was at the time that I was discovered to be transgender in 2012, going back now almost 13 years, I was meeting with the First Presidency on a monthly basis to review the temple projects, designs, and constructions. And, they knew me so very well. And for me to be able to then say, this is who I am, unfortunately, they didn't want to know more at that time. They claimed in time that they wanted to understand being transgender better, but they had me right there where they could have asked and could have talked with me, and that didn't happen. Instead, I was placed on probation at work and went 4 years as an employee under the dark cloud of my actions away from the office building might cause me to walk in on any given day and be terminated, packed up and accompanied by security out of the building. That was a real threat on a daily basis because I'd been told, as I outline again in my story, I had been told I could not do certain things and remain an employee. And over time, I couldn't not do those 5 things that I was told to avoid. Every single one of them became a necessity in my life. And I reached the point this was in the late summer of 2016, when I was really already living authentically as Laurie Lee everywhere outside of the church offices. I put my priesthood uniform back on to go to work. But when I got home, all of that came off, and I was Laurie Lee 24/7, including attending church services on Sunday as Laurie Lee. I finally went to our department leadership, and you may not be aware, but state of Utah passed a law more than a year before this point in time that protected the employment of transgender employees so long as they didn't work for a religious employer. And so I knew the law, that my employer had a loophole in the law and didn't have to honor this, but I pled with my department leadership to grant me the accommodation that was available by law to every other employer-employee relationship in the state of Utah. And I was promised to get an answer to that question. So even up until that moment, I was hopeful that maybe they can just change the name on my door and I can start to accomplish this great work that I was doing as my authentic self. Wouldn't that be cool? And then 5 days later, my state president took my recommend away, which disqualified me from being a church employee. And he knew, and I knew, that there was no reason to take my recommend away other than the fact that someone at church headquarters called him and told him, take Laurie Lee's recommend away, or take, dead name's recommend away. So I had to retire quickly before I got fired. And that was when it became totally clear to me that my employment wasn't going to be protected. But I still, at that point, had this kind of unbridled optimism that I had a place in activity in the LDS church, and that I would do everything I could. There's a story here in the United States when there was an attempt to overcome the segregation that existed, particularly in the southern part of the United States. And then we're going back to just before my lifetime in the late 1950s, when a gal by the name of Rosa Parks, who was Black, decided that she wasn't going to be told to move to the back of the bus where all of the African American people were asked to sit. So the analogy that I clung to was Rosa Parks kept her seat on the bus and felt that she belonged. And I felt in the same way. I felt I belong in this church. I belong in this chair in church meetings. And I've done so much to build this church and to serve in this church and contribute in every way. I'm not going to give up my seat. And then the excommunication took place. And it was so incredibly obvious that it was for no particular reason other than church headquarters demanded that it take place.
Because
What?
we have transgender members of the church. There is reason to hope. Purely doctrinally, there is no reason why someone should not be able to transition according to the core doctrines of the church, what we're finding. And so we have good reason to hope. We have good reason to be optimistic. And right up until that moment where you hear the outcome, to be holding on, so that seat on the bus, I'm just sort of visualizing you gripping onto that seat, and it can't. Surely no one's going to drag you off that bus. Surely everyone else on that bus isn't going to stand up and say, you need to get off now. Talk to us about what was happening. Sorry, Sarah, on you go.
I was just going to say, Laurie Lee, could we just go back for just a moment? When your stake president took your temper recommend from you, what reason was given to you at that moment by him for that action?
Well, I skimmed over that story just a little bit, but it was a Tuesday evening when he first asked for my recommend. And I went through, and I described this in detail in a chapter in the book. I had been his predecessor, and he had been my counselor. And I said, President, we both have the temple recommend questions memorized. Let's go through them one more time. And I basically offered an interview to myself where I asked and then answered all of the questions that existed at that time. And his response was, I see no reason to take your recommend away. Well, what I suspected but didn't know for sure at the time was he'd already been told to cancel my recommend. And so I went out of the room rejoicing, assuming that I had, accomplished my defense successfully. 2 days later, he called me back in and repeated he needed to take my recommend away. And at that point, I was confirmed in my heart that I knew that he was a puppet whose strings were being pulled. He had already told me he saw no reason to take my recommend. And so at that point, I just sat and didn't say a word. I was silent before my accuser, and he had no accusation to make. Eventually, I stood up. I was presenting as Laurie in that interview, and I stood up and let them look at me for a moment. And I said, President, your judgment is unjust. And I walked out of the room, knowing full well that the next day I had to retire because they were going to catch up with me and fire me if I didn't get ahead of them.
And can I ask, that's just an appalling way to treat you. It really is. Were you in a calling at that moment, at that point?
At that time, I had recently been released as the gospel doctrine teacher because he really didn't want me teaching gospel doctrine as Laurie Lee, although I did once against his will.
Of course she did.
But then I was formally released from that calling about, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 weeks later was when the recommend went bye-bye.
So they're very clear that they were honing in. They were actually trying to behave in a way that was clearly to drive you as far away from active involved membership as possible.
And later on, the following year, leading up to the disciplinary council that ended my membership, the same stake president sat down with me and said, you're instructed to detransition back to male presentation or write a letter and resign your membership in the church. And I thought, with all my training as an ecclesiastical leader, I had never heard anyone ever ask a member to write a letter and resign. I thought that I was more appalled by the policy problems of what he was saying than its impact upon me. But I said, President, it's destructive to my mental and emotional health to detransition. I've come too far. At that point,
Yeah.
I'd been on hormone therapy for 2 years. Things had changed. I couldn't go back, and I couldn't go back to that prison or that hell that I had been experiencing. And I said, and it's not in my heart to resign from the church. And then he said, next breath, then we'll have to hold a disciplinary council. And so I knew what the outcome of the disciplinary council was going to be, because they already wanted me to voluntarily leave the
Yes.
church. So it was
Yeah.
totally evident to me that when this meeting took place, I don't know, some 3 weeks
Yeah.
later, that
And
the
was,
outcome was a given, a foregone conclusion.
yeah, appalling. Was he ever willing to name the position of the person who told him to take your temper recommend away?
No, he claimed, and I knew he was fibbing, he claimed that it was his decision. Well, it was his decision to follow the direction of whoever had called him.
Yeah.
And I have since talked with a friend of mine who he and his wife left the church in part because of how I was treated. He was the stake executive secretary at the time and overheard the conversation on the phone where the president was told to take my recommend by someone at headquarters who was literally, calling out the stake president under the carpet and take care of business. It was not his desire to do that. Please go ahead.
I was going to say that a lot of what we do via this podcast is to focus on safeguarding, and often people equate that with child protection policies. And we've been trying to push the narrative sort of further, because safeguarding is about keeping everyone safe, but particularly as it applies to vulnerable groups and marginalised groups, such as the transgender community, such as queer and the LGBT spectrum, and more. There are so many different aspects of this. What I'm wondering is, what one of the comments has sort of pointed out that the church need to do better to understand the transgender experience. Would you be able to share with us? Because we have an audience who are made up of active Latter-day Saints, lots of people who've left the church, and lots of people from other faith communities. So we have a very broad audience. Would you be able to speak to what is the transgender experience, and what would have been the impact had you taken the request, if you had accepted the request to detransition? Would you talk about that for a moment?
Wow, big question. So first of all, I honor what y'all have been doing with regard to protecting, safeguarding individuals. One wouldn't think that a 50-something-year-old adult with lots of experience in the church would need safeguarding, but in that circumstance, as a marginalized member of a minority group, in this case gender variant, I was a victim of spiritual violence. And although I'm a big girl and I managed to endure that and get through it, there was a lot of trauma associated with that. The 2 chapters that describe my disciplinary counsel are spiritual violence, and the next chapter was in the house of my friends. So the 2 together that tell that story, spiritual violence in the house of my friends. And they were my friends. They were my friends and neighbors. They were, I was living in Utah, and I could literally walk to the houses of all 16 members of my disciplinary council. We lived in very tight quarters there in a small community in Utah. Had I detransitioned, what would have happened? Well, there would have been enormous personal impacts for me. I know that was the case. I can detail and have detailed how near I came to not being able to continue to live. There were true life and death issues associated with that. Interestingly, to yourselves and your audience, I'm sure, when that took place, and I was told specifically, detransition to male or write a letter and resign your membership. What I didn't know at that moment, but found out a few days later, was someone else in another stake in northern Utah had just sat down with their stake president and had been told the exact same sentence verbatim.
Right.
So, and I described this in detail in the notes in the book. There was a concerted, coordinated effort going on how to manage transgender members at that time. And I explain in the narrative and its notes, its footnotes, what was going on with regard to the church and gender identity at that time that caused them to be so aggressively punitive towards individuals who were trying to self-determine their gender identity and just simply come to church and worship according to the dictates of their conscience. Hence the name of the book. At that time, the church did not have written policies in place. They had covert verbal teachings to stake presidents in place. And I share in the book a couple of agenda items from stake presidency training meetings and area authority training meetings at that time in 2016 going into 2017, where discussion of how to handle transgender members was taking place. And it sets this whole time frame, which happened to be coinciding as well at roughly the same time that the ordained women movement, was taking place and sticking in the craw of the church. So there's this whole historical dialogue about what was going on in those years, 2013, 14, 15, 16, with regard to the church trying to sort out gender identity and what they were going to say about it and do about it. You may remember the classic quotation from Dallin Oaks in 2015 to the Salt Lake Tribune that we don't know a lot about transgender. We don't understand that yet, but we have a lot to, basically my words, a lot to learn and a lot we'll need to teach about that. At that time, I was thrilled that a senior church leader had spoken the word transgender, and it scared the bejeebers out of me what he might do now that he was starting to focus on us. That focus.
So it wasn't even that you had hope that actually he was going to seek to understand your experience better. You hear that statement and you fear. I mean, how telling is that?
Yeah, January of 2015, now 10 years ago, he said, we've got more we need to learn and teach about this. And I thought, great, but holy, I don't know what's going to happen when he does. My excommunication took place at the midpoint of that statement in January 2015, and his then publicly saying in October of 2029, exactly bookending my excommunication. In October of 2019, he said, gender as spoken of in the family proclamation means biological sex at birth. And that statement, making that statement, I called, when I spoke to the Salt Lake Tribune a few days later, I called that a dark day for transgender Latter-day Saints. And it was because the conclusion of their thinking brought them to a point where they declared, as at least policy, if not pseudo doctrine, that regardless of the way the family proclamation, which is a highly weaponized document, the way that it reads, that gender is an essential characteristic of our eternal identity, paraphrasing slightly. I had always felt great about that because that resonated with me. And I had a number of spiritual experiences and a true witness that my eternal gender identity, this part of me that the proclamation proclaims, is that I've always been female, that I was required to live for a while in mortality, making a presentation that was male, but my eternal pre-earth life, way I'm experiencing mortality, and my eternal future is as a female. And the proclamation was supportive of that until President Oaks comes out and says that, oh no, what we were talking about in the proclamation, and he's saying this now 24 years later, is that we meant biological sex at birth, which is so problematic on many levels. In fact, it doesn't even address individuals that are intersex. But the fact of the matter is that somehow an occurrence in your physical body that brings you to a point where a doctor or a nurse looks at a child, an infant, and says X or Y, pun intended, that somehow designates who this beautiful creature is in terms of their spiritual nature, eternities in the past and eternities to come. First of all, it's insane, but it's so contrary to our lived experiences as transgender individuals that the statement alone negates our existence. However,
Laurie Lee,
yes,
sorry, please continue. Oh, I wanted to ask because Sarah had talked to me about this a few days ago. Will you share with the audience how you got your name? How did you get the name Laurie Lee?
I love this.
Yeah. Sarah's cheating because she heard my story at Brighton years ago.
Yeah.
In fact, when I think about it, we weren't under the curse of President Oaks's statement at the time I was in Brighton. We were still living in that happy time where we weren't sure what was going to happen. But this story about my name indicates just how much of my life I've known who I am. And I had a sense of gender incongruity. In other words, specifically that the world and my family and society was telling me to live as a little boy. And I felt that wasn't who I was since I was like 5 years old, since I was old enough as a child to have awareness of gender, of boy and girl. I had already made up my mind as to how I felt. But when I was 7, my mom approached me, and I happened to have my sisters and my cousin were with me at the time we were playing. And she's, for some unknown reason to me, she said, looking at me, if you had been born a girl, my ears prick up. She said, your name would have been Laurie Lee. And I knew at that moment, although I didn't say it out loud because I already knew by that point that it was kind of dangerous to identify as anything but what they were trying to get me to be. But I knew the name by which I self-identified at 7 years old. 45 years later, when I finally came out to my parents, I told them, I said, and the name that I plan to live the rest of my life by is the one you chose for me before I was born. And interestingly, I have 2 younger sisters. They didn't use that name that they loved for either of my sisters. That seemed to be reserved for me. But in this idea that who have I been always? I have always been Laurie Lee as long as I've been aware on this earth. And so all that being the case, if you take what President Oaks taught in October of 2019, I think I'm getting back to one of your original questions. If the big issue is sex assigned at birth. The policy restrictions that just came out in August of this past year speak constantly against those who transition away from their biological sex at birth. That dark day statement of gender means sex assigned at birth, they're now doubling down and restricting anyone who dares to transition away from their biological sex at birth. So that policy is so onerous that there's no wiggle room for local priesthood leaders to work with local transgender members and their families at all. There's no space hardly for us to go.
Can I say, Laurie Lee, can I just say in relation to that policy, we at 21st Century Saints, along with so many other people, are utterly appalled at the recent transgender policy that came out. And one of the things that we have done with support and with other people is to try and reach out to venues that may host FSY and events like that in the future to say, you are a university establishment, you should be upholding freedom and discrimination. You have pledges that you will not have a hate platform of speech in your premises. Can you please look at whether you should be allowing a church that acts in such a discriminatory manner to our trans brothers and sisters to use your venue? And so there's some work that we're trying to encourage people to do around bringing to the attention of local venues, members of parliament, local decision makers, that it's absolutely not okay for a church in the UK that pledges to follow the law of the land, that says that's what they do, that benefits really, really well from tax breaks and charity status, for them to discriminate against a very marginalised group. So I just wanted to just make our audience aware that there are people trying to say, this is not okay. We have to take practical steps to make other people aware of this and to try and prevent this happening in the name of, in the name of religion that they're trying to do this in. And we're trying to say, no, stop. So I'm sorry, I just wanted to put that out there because I think it's important for our audience to know that that needs to be done, and all communities need to be raising this as a concern and encouraging people to say, not in our name.
No, that's very, very good.
I think that's the point of what we're sort of trying to say is that and what we're going to be sort of suggesting later on in the podcast is no matter what someone tells you you need to do, you don't have to do it. You do not have to be obedient to something that is morally reprehensible. And so just to empower people to be able to do that. But what I was thinking about, Laurie Lee, was you have been summoned to at this point in your story, you've been summoned to an excommunication hearing. It was disciplinary council in its strongest possible terms. Everyone who commits sin isn't necessarily called to disciplinary council. Not even for some of the most extreme types of criminal activity. It's not even a given that you must be called. But you're called for the most serious of punitive church actions, and you're to be offered a choice where spiritual violence is going to be done to you by taking away your membership and all that implies, all that goes with that. You're going to be cast out of this community, and your church and worship life will be silenced. And you're having to weigh that up against having to choose to undertake an act of physical violence against yourself, of mental, emotional violence, and also, and I think that was why I was really keen for you to share your story about your name, that this actually would have been an act of spiritual violence too, because your identity is female. You had a name waiting for you. This is who you are. And to act in a way that would be incongruous with that would be an offense in the eyes of God, if you're having to, very, very clearly deny who he has made you to be. What happened after the excommunication? What did your life look like? How did you pick up the pieces?
It was challenging, and I do hope that we come back to the restrictions later in the conversation.
Let's do it now. We can do it now if you prefer. We can go with your chronology. Yeah.
Things that I wanted to reinforce, and that is that the restrictions have made church unsafe for using things that should resonate with your audience. The church is now unsafe for transgender individuals, for individuals who are questioning their gender identity. And even so far, and I mentioned this in the afterword of the book that we rewrote when the restrictions came out. We rewrote the afterword specifically to address the restrictions. I noted that particularly our young people, youth and young adults who may not identify as gender variant at all, but who may vary in some fashion in their presentation or actions from the strict binary gender norm, are going to come under the watchful eye now of a new surveillance society and culture where they are not safe within their chapel walls, within their activities as members of the church, simply because they may not fit into the perfect for the strength of youth gender binary presentation or actions or interests. That makes a whole lot of innocent people unsafe and cannot stand. It just cannot stand.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and so I love what you're saying to those in authority in your country, that don't be party to supporting this notion that a gender variant person has to be escorted off the property before nightfall. Just remarkably harmful. And don't let that happen. Okay, we can come back to the rest of all of that later. So your current question is one more of what did my life look like right after the excommunication? And there's a couple of interesting stories I tell in the chapter that follows the two spiritual violence and in the house of my friends. And that one's titled "The Sun Rises" or something to that effect. My bishop, who was incidentally was released and deposed as bishop the morning of my excommunication, and he was released because he supported me. He was released early, and that was painfully obvious. He wrote to me on his way to work the following morning, the Monday morning. He said, "I noticed that the sun came up today." His metaphoric way of saying that, life is going on regardless of what happened. I immediately, in my grieving and my analysis and my self-talk, recognized that nothing that the excommunication had done had impacted my relationship with God at all. I had had an administrative action by an institution of men take action against me because they disagreed with me, but God was not in that, and God did not excommunicate me, and nothing separated me from God's love. And that was a powerful thing to take with me. And then go ahead.
All the church did was they shuffled your name from one list to another list. They shuffled your name from a list of members to a list of non-members. It's paper shuffling. That's all they're doing.
Yeah, an administrative action. So,
yeah.
Jane, you've mentioned that the purpose of this spiritual violence was probably to discredit me and to silence me. And as I sit here doing interview after interview, how did that work out?
Right.
I'm definitely not silent.
Right.
But anyway, let me tell you about what happened 48 hours after the disciplinary council. My last big project as an employee of the church was expanding the Provo, Utah Missionary Training Center. And it was a gloriously large and very visible project for the church. I had been forced into retirement before the construction was finished, but I had been invited by those in charge of the project and those in charge of the Missionary Training Center to participate in a VIP tour of the completed project when it was done. And it turned out that that VIP tour was 2 days after my excommunication. And so I wrote to my friend who was the head of the MTC and said, Richard, I'm going to be excommunicated by the time that happens. And you know I have to be there presenting as Laurie Lee, so I'm going to look like a senior sister missionary, and I'm not even going to be a member of the church at that point. And I told him, I said, I am really okay if that's too distracting, and you can't have me there. And his response, completely opposite of the disciplinary council, which shows his good heart, was, you absolutely need to be here. And he wrapped me into this tour with area authorities and church department leaders and all of this, and introduced me as Laurie Lee Hall, the chief architect of the expansion of the MTC, and made me feel so welcome, and introduced me to all the missionaries we met along the way as the chief architect for the project. And how did she do? What's your experience like here in the MTC? And golly, it was wonderful. And I say in conclusion in that chapter of the book, I felt like I had experienced two completely different churches. And what happened that Tuesday night during the tour helped heal me from what had happened to me that Sunday night in my stake center. And it truly represents such a broad spectrum difference of how an individual could choose to be treated by other individuals in authority and by the organization. There are other examples of this as well. I wrote a whole chapter about my experiences with a little ward that I found in downtown Salt Lake, Liberty Ward in the Salt Lake Liberty Stake. And I didn't live exactly within their boundaries, but nobody seemed to care. And I showed up and was just brought in and given a huge hug by this lovely little ward. And the stories that are in that hold a very important place in dictates of conscience. And I've actually had more readers come back to me in writing, talking about their experiences and saying that chapter about the Liberty Ward and my experiences there after my excommunication and how wonderfully receptive they all were to me. That's their favorite and most positive experience with my book, was that little chapter, because it shows how the true church, a Christian church that follows the Spirit of Christ, should be treating its members of minority.
Yeah.
And this is who the church really can be, who the church really is, so often, the church at its best self. We have some more questions to ask you, and the chat has posted some questions too. And I just want to thank everyone in the chat. Your comments, your questions, we really appreciate them. There's a great dialogue going on. What's really important right now that we want to stress is we really want you to go and buy this book. You have to get this book. Now, I'm going to speak to the UK experience first of all. If you want to get the book, it is a little bit harder to come by. We can get it via good old or bad old Amazon, whichever way you want to look at it. But it's still an import at the moment, and it's taking, my copy has still not arrived yet. Now, it's a lot shorter of a delivery time at the moment than it used to be a couple of months ago, but so it's maybe something like about 2 weeks at the moment, which is good. It will eventually get to the point where it's a matter of days.
You can download
Sarah
it on Amazon.
got ahead of the game. Yep, Sarah downloaded it on Kindle, which is great, but we want people to have copies of this on your shelf.
Yeah.
You know, we want you to be reading this book. It's stunning. The artwork, the mood, the title. The title is incredible. So we want you to buy the book, but if you are in the US, then you have no excuse. People like me, we can't even get it. We can't even access it with convenience. You can all just go buy it. Go buy your book, and let us know what you think.
And I will still be buying. I will be buying a paper copy of this book when I can get hold of it. I just wanted to read it, and I didn't want to wait for Amazon's timescale or for any of our big stores like Waterstones to get it in stock. I wanted to read it. I'm probably about halfway through it, and it is stunning. It's powerful, it's emotional. It really speaks to a lifetime of knowing who you are and having people around you not wanting you to know who you are and not wanting to know who you are themselves. And it speaks to fear. It speaks to that unconscionable position where people are willing to hate and reject something just because they don't understand. And there's no room for that. God is not in that. I don't know where anybody can see God in thinking, I don't understand, therefore I'm going to hate and reject. God isn't anywhere in that. It's a really powerful book. There's some really good experiences to read about. And I think, people need to get a hold of this, and they need to be reading it. They need to be discussing it. They need to be talking about it. Just talk about what the title means, Dictates of Conscience. Just talk about that. So next time you're in Sunday school or Relief
It's perfect for a book group. Yeah.
Talk about it.
Yeah. Oh, Sarah's been rubbing my face in it for the past couple of days. Really, because she's ahead of the game. And you've had so many, you've already had lots of powerful experiences with this book. So this is your message. Go forth and buy the book and enjoy.
Can I ask a really, really basic question? Probably goes without saying, but what was your motivation and hope in writing this book and in making this available to the wider public?
So that's a big question. And I had always wanted to tell this story because it felt like it was worthy of being told. As time went on, I came to realize that my life as a church member, a church leader, and a senior employee of the church created a really interesting background for the impact of what took place ultimately in my life. And that gave me something of a responsibility to use my voice to tell my story. But then as time went on even further, I became just overwhelmingly inspired, motivated, called upon by the Spirit to get this written and to get it written by now. And when I realized, just as we were concluding our editing, that this restrictive policy of the church came out just as we were putting the last dots on the I's, I thought, absolutely, this is here for this reason. When I saw what happened in the US election just 2 weeks before the book hit the store shelves, and the unthinkable happened, that it turned out the way that it did, it occurred to me that what I had written, going all the way back to my preface where I talked about what happened to transgender people and other marginalized people in Nazi Germany in 1933, and how likely we suddenly were, how close we suddenly were to having truly fascist things happen to our communities again. I thought this is also what was driving me to write this book. This past Monday, the new president of the United States wrote an executive order that basically takes gender identity and gender ideology, as they call it, out of US legal doctrines and policies. We have been legally erased as of Monday if this holds and is implemented. I had decided months and months before the upcoming election that took place in November that the main reason for writing Dictates of Conscience was to humanize the reality of gender identity and to more clearly than I could possibly imagine to state that gender identity is real. It can't just be swept away as an ideology, as a choice. Gender identity is real. And I state this in the preface of the book that I wrote towards the end. The purpose of telling my story and telling it now is to humanize gender identity, to show that gender identity is real from the telling of my story going back 60 plus years, that gender dysphoria is a real medical and mental health issue that has a way to be treated and mitigated. And that issue of gender affirming healthcare is a big challenge we're facing both here and on your side of the Atlantic, where the unconscionable thing is happening. When I was a young person, gender affirming healthcare wasn't available in the 1960s and 70s to a young person like myself. And I struggled, and a lot of people my age didn't survive as a result of not having such healthcare. I'm in a worse place today because I went 50 years before I could receive such healthcare. It's unconscionable to me that politicians at this point would be choosing to ban that available and life-saving healthcare to satisfy a political agenda and take off the table to young people who desperately need the comprehensive care that's all a part of the standardized system of gender affirming healthcare, that this is taking off the table from kids who need it. And it's just incredibly unconscionable that that's the case. And finally, to prove through writing Dictates of Conscience that it has a hopeful and happy ending, because I'm still here and I'm thriving and living and loving and able to speak to these things. And by definition, by transference, so can everyone else. That this is a fight that can be fought and won, and it really matters that our voices are out there and our stories get told. So that's why Dictates of Conscience exists.
That's wonderful. I know for a long time, certainly going back a little bit, you and Nancy were both attending church. How has these recent policies impacted on that?
I mentioned towards the end in the afterword that due to very specific circumstances in our home ward, where we got a very transphobic Relief Society president, that around 2022, after the pandemic eased, it just wasn't safe for us to attend our home ward anymore.
Okay.
We'd been attending
I'm so
sporadically,
sorry.
but it's, it's like, we're just not going to fight with this person who just refused at that time to accept that I existed. And so that was a little advanced precursor, if you will, to what the reality of the current restrictions are, where I couldn't attend Relief Society at this point without the bishop going against what the stake president's going to require him to do. We don't have a gender neutral bathroom in our old church building where we meet next to the Louisville Temple. So I either hold it for the hour that I'm at church, which, yeah, that can happen, or someone has to stand outside the door. Or I get to go to the men's room again. And unless you've cleaned the church lately, you don't know how tough men's room.
Right.
No, it's ultimately the restrictions haven't affected me because I wasn't going anymore anyway. My concern about the restrictions is what it's done for our friends who were successfully active in church as transition members and holding callings and being accepted and being loved and being in their honored in their Relief Society and priesthood meetings for who they are, who are now leaving the church or feeling they can never return because there's now no place for them. That deeply concerns me.
Yeah, that's
I agree.
Issues.
So our audience have a couple of questions, and we had chatted briefly about this backstage before we went live. And I'd like to sort of handle them to give you time to think one after the other. So the first question was about Sarah and I were most thinking about this week is particularly our transgender siblings over in the USA after Monday's announcement. Are you safe? So I know our audience want to know your feelings about that, and I know that a lot of people who are looking up to you would love to hear your wisdom about it. But in addition to that, we've also got someone who's asking about about young people and what your feelings are about their experience while they're at BYU and in the church education system. I guess I'm asking, do you have any advice for younger transgender people who are experiencing just what feels like absolute chaos just now? We're in the United Kingdom and we're seeing it. So I can't imagine what it's like actually living it. So let's start with, are you safe?
Well, that's that's the fundamental question. Certainly the United States at the federal level feels as though it's no longer safe. But if we become too wrapped up in the fact that the current head of state has declared that gender identity no longer legally exists, if we can get past that erasure and recognize that it's okay, I'm still here, I'm still breathing, I'm still standing. We have an interesting situation in the fact that the way the United States is assembled, there are, yes, federal government laws and federal government programs, but there are also state government laws and state programs. And a big issue in the history of the United States is states' rights versus federal oversight and control. And there are still about 23 or 24 states in the United States that in one way or another have established themselves as transgender safe states, sanctuary states, if you will. Utah is not one of them. Utah is a dangerous place. Where I live in Kentucky, technically a dangerous place. There are some cities within states that are sanctuary cities because their local government has said, we're not going to let that happen here. So it's an interesting combination of implementation of these things. And I think the important thing to watch, and a newscaster here in the United States has stated that in times like these, what's important is to focus on what they do, not become overwhelmed by what they say. And I think that's a particularly healthy way to be at this point. Nothing that occurred on Monday results in much doing. There's very little implementation that comes as a result of what happened Monday. The words are horribly painful, but what's already been put in place, I think I mentioned off camera earlier that I've been really concerned about getting my passport, which has been identified as a female passport going back to the Obama era in 2016 when I had that change made. I needed to update my passport so that it would be good throughout the next 10 years and all of this chaos, and hopefully get to the other side. What we're hearing currently is the thinking is that the changes that they make where they limit identity documents, federal identity documents, to biological sex at birth again, isn't going to be retroactive to people like myself who'd already made these changes sometime in the past. So the degree to which something is implemented is important. However, I greatly fear for young people, both because of what the government is doing, because of what state governments in 26 states have done, and that in the course of the last 2 or 3 years of legislative sessions, and what the church has done, which parallels the political agenda, is that young people unable to reconcile their identity with their faith when it comes to the church, being able to attend school in a safe place where if the school's receiving federal funds, the teacher now doesn't have to choose to use an individual's chosen name or chosen pronouns. That these things, as they get implemented, is going to make the experience of a young person truly onerous. And unfortunately, as these things occur, it's as though folks who have a kind of a tendency to discriminate feel that they're empowered to be discriminatory, feel that they're empowered to be negative, to be harmful, to be hurtful. And unfortunately, there are just an unknown number of potential victims to a population who chooses and feels empowered to be harmful, hurtful.
It is a dark time for people that are trying to live out who they are, to live with statements like that from heads of state. Do you think the attitude of the current President of America and his executive order is going to embolden the church in their discriminatory practices?
I think the church knew what was coming and actually acted in advance of what actually happened. It's hard to imagine if the election had gone a different way, how naked and exposed the church was going to have felt for thinking the way that they were thinking. Now they look like they completely fall in line. The church is conservative when it comes to speaking of gender, when you look at what the government is now saying, at least the word gender still exists in Latter-day Saint world. It just now doesn't exist in the federal discussion. If I could, to put a brighter twist, though, on the circumstances, because there is darkness all around. But I think one of the values of my story, and I promote my story because I believe it has the ability to help change hearts and change lives. But I believe that about everyone else's story as well, as they are shared. But if you look at, for example, my experiences, I was facing these same kind of difficulties and pressures 13 years ago. And in an environment where I was trapped and was the potential victim. And so I describe years of working through those difficulties and getting to the other side and being healthy and happy and at peace and full of love and able to forgive and to move on and to live and thrive. There's a way to take that story and everyone else's stories and apply them to ourselves and say, okay, that worked in that period of time, that person persevered, we can do this too. And we've got to work through our time frame and where we are today, and we're going to persevere as well. The intention of Dictates of Conscience is to provide hope and to provide maybe light a path forward, and not study how I managed to not focus on all the terrible things that were taking place, and focus on the end goal with an eye to being true to myself and being true to the spiritual witness I had of who I was. Having a testimony from God that I was a beloved daughter of my heavenly parents sure did help when I was sitting in front of general authorities, men of authority, who were trying to tell me I was wrong. And I testify that, no, this is what I know. I know what this is true. I know that God knows who I am because God made me this way. And this is my sure witness. And, end of debate.
I have this dynamic with my non-binary kid who's now 17 years old, and I think they're quite reflective of their generation. A very dark sense of humor, because things have got so dark that the only way they can deal with stuff is just to make light of it and find the humor in it, and it brings such joy to me, and it helps them to cope. But here, when the questions about what kids are experiencing at BYU and how they're coping, and it just makes me so aware that this generation, when they're asking, how did you do, how did you get through this, how are you managing, how did you cope through all of this stuff? And these kids are, they're teenagers, and they feel absolutely wrecked by what's happening in the world. It's so horrific, and I think not only have you experienced this over such a long period of time, and I say this with all the love in the world, because the United Kingdom, we could say the same thing here, but politics, America, Europe is crazy. It has always been crazy. It's always going to be crazy. I think what kids are up against today, that is making it very, very different, is people in authority, whether that's the government or whether that's the church, who are telling them things that are not true. And by that, I mean objectively tried and tested scientifically. This is not true. So that if someone is telling you this is not factual, this is not real, when you can see it in front of your face, when you're reading about it in textbooks, when the consensus of academia is no, we can see, we can evidence this. And while you're that's based on knowledge, while your lived experience, trans women are at a higher risk of violence, of extreme trauma and marginalization. So when someone's reality is being challenged like that, I think our children, I think they need role models like you to show them that there is hope. One of the questions here, Ashley has been with us in the chat, and thank you so much for your comments, everyone. Ashley asks, is the church leadership from a different time, she quotes, being reflected in the entire church culture as it happens with top down with congregations? So what she's asking is, you know how people always make excuses for older family members saying they're from a different time? Well, do you think that what's happening with transgender policies in the church, do you think it's a reflection of the fact that the leaders of the church are in their 80s and 90s?
Excellent question. When you were reading that question, what came to my mind is my 86-year-old parents who are still alive and
Right.
have never been Latter-day Saints, and how well they accepted me, and how potentially hard it could have been to realize when I was in my 50s that I was making this big change in my life, but that they've so well accommodated that in their own understanding and treatment of me. Granted, neither of them is quite 100 yet, but they are in their later 80s at this point. So in my mind, it's not so much about age, because I can show you my Nancy's father, who is 89, who totally loves and accepts me. It's just, honestly, I don't know if it's because they know who I am. They know me as a person. They can feel my goodness. I think it helps enormously when people know someone who's trans or someone who's gay or whatever it may be. I think that kind of relationship is important, but I look at senior individuals and don't see that you can paint that generation with one paintbrush and say it's because they're old. I would more say that it's because leaders of the church are attempting to maintain a doctrinal and kind of religious organization and a school operational structure that relies upon hard and fast gender binary.
Yes.
Could I be accepted into the church without changing any doctrine? I think we talked about this perhaps towards the beginning or even before we came on. There are zero basic doctrines of the church that would prevent me from having access to all of the ordinances of the gospel, all of the breadth and fullness of the gospel, except for that one little teaching that came out on October 2019, which is sexual assignment at birth. And that's not doctrine. That's a teaching of an individual. And someday, some president of the church may stand up in some future day and say, well, that was his interpretation, just has been the case with regard to a number of other gospel essay topics. That was just his interpretation. And see, we always had it right. We said in the family proclamation that gender is an essential characteristic of identity. And boy, were we right in 1995, and we've always meant it. And they'd never say sorry to all those that were harmed along the way. But the day may come where that'll all change. Until that day comes, then the church really has no place for us. And I would,
And I think what
Yeah.
I think what is wonderful about humanity, I completely agree with what you're saying about age. I think what's wonderful is I've been able to witness. Ashley points out her mum is also supportive and affirming. Yeah, when you know someone and love them and choose to listen, tell me what your experience is like. What does this mean to you? Explain to me what is dysphoria? What does that feel like in your body? When you're listening to someone's experience, you then have a choice about how you're going to love them going forward, and that has to be what we say we're going to do. We're going to walk together. This is what we commit to do. Where I think it's been unconscionable and so sad. It really hurts my heart for, well, obviously they don't need more pity than, I don't know if they necessarily deserve it, but people around the desk who had the opportunity to know you actively chose not to.
yeah,
And that flies in the face of what it means to keep your covenants. That flies in the face of what it is to follow the path of Jesus Christ, to choose not to listen. And I think that's why your book is so powerful, because it's this individual who's saying, here's my story, come and know me. This is what it feels like. This is what my journey has felt like. And we get to know you, and we get to love you.
Which
I don't know. I'm going to come to you in a second, Sarah. But I don't know if you're aware of this. But for our audience who might not be aware, the Brodie Awards are an annual celebration of all things Mormon, ex-Mormon, and you can go online, vote for your ex-Mormon of the year, who is our beloved Brit Venger, Nemo the Mormon. Laurie Lee Hall won the, now what is the exact title of the category? The Best LDS Interest Book, Narrative Nonfiction, 2024 for Dictates of Conscience. Congratulations for winning your Brodie Award, Laurie Lee. That's wonderful. And I think it just goes to show how well loved your work has been. It's been really well received. So yeah, Sarah, you were gonna make a comment.
I was just going to say, talking about being well loved and well respected and a role model and example to all, which we know Laurie Lee is just all of those things. We understand you are presenting at the Mormon History Association. So would you like to tell our audience about that?
Yes, I'm really excited about that. It's an outfall of Dictates of Conscience, and my work with my editor publisher, Barbara Jones Brown, who herself is a historian, and she's the director of Signature Books that published my book, but also personally worked as the editor for Dictates of Conscience. She took my ramblings of 140,000 words in an early draft manuscript and helped me condense that into what we called concentrated orange juice at almost half the size of what I originally wrote. But she taught me too the value of telling my narrative in such a way that it feels very much like a historical document. And we discovered along the way that I'm probably among the first, if not the first, to so fully treat the topic of gender identity at the intersection of the LDS church experience, as the church was going from having no idea what to do about gender identity to where they are today. In other words, the history of the church bumping up against and dealing with and trying to figure out how to manage and control their members and teach what they wanted to teach about gender identity, including right up until the release of the recent restrictions. So we had the idea, Barbara and I, that I could put together from my work and my research and just all the notes that I have, a paper and submit to the Mormon History Association on gender identity in conflict with the LDS Church throughout the 21st century. And lo and behold, they accepted that paper. And I'm presenting it in Ogden, Utah in June, and being part of a panel that talks about the disassociations in our community overall. And I'm really honored to be able to be at a point where, you know, I kind of stand as a voice and a historian of this experience, which really is a 21st century experience that certainly hasn't reached the end chapter. This is just the first chapter of this intersection and the complexities of gender identity, as opposed to just male-female gender, but gender identity in the Latter-day Saints.
Excellent. I think that would be really informative, fabulous for people to be able to listen to that.
Absolutely. We'll drop a link into the show notes to let you know where you can get your.
Oh, okay. We've lost Jane for a moment. I'm not sure where Jane's disappeared to. Hopefully she'll be back. We will put a note and a link into our
Sorry, we had a bit of a technical problem there that just booted us out. So mid-speech, I think the internet was getting a bit nervous about how long I've been speaking for. So again, we'll drop the link in the chat to the conference, and hopefully you can make it along. And we wish you every success for that. I also just want to thank, we've had a donation in the chat, and just to quickly tell you what we're going to do with your money is going to make more safeguarding booklets that we are getting out to our local elected representatives. We've already had some fantastic conversations, so every penny that we get is going to make more of these little guys so that we can have conversations about how we can keep people safe in religious settings. So we hope you'll find it useful. If you want your own PDF copy, send us a message. We will send that to you absolutely free of charge. And if you're in the UK and you would like a postal copy, we can post one out to you. We are asking if you can make a donation. That would really help with our work to be able to get them where they need to be. If you want to sponsor a state president who you think needs one, for example, or if you want to get one to your local member of parliament, then let us know and we can help sort that out for you. Sarah.
I was just going to say, if you want your state president, your bishop to have a copy of this informative booklet that we're really happy about, if you want somebody that you know in church leadership to receive it and you don't want to hand it over personally, let us know who that person is you want it to go to, and we will send it to them. And we will just say that somebody within their congregation has requested that we send this booklet to them. The rest of you who are feeling able to do it, we're asking you to use your missionary skills that you've been well schooled in as members of this church, your Book of Mormon placement skills that every single one of us has fine-honed, and use those very skills that the church taught you to do to speak up, to speak truth to power, and to get the message out about safeguarding our trans community, our gay community, and our vulnerable children and adults. Use the skills the church gave you to ensure that the church are doing the work that God would have them do.
Thank you so much, Sarah. So we're going to go to closing thoughts from Laurie Lee. So if there's anything that you'd like to share at this point, but in particular, I would love it if you would perhaps be willing to give us some thoughts on how allies can be more affirming for our transgender and gender non-conforming siblings. What can we do to support? And do you have any messages for people who are transgender, who are who are struggling at the moment. It's the times at the moment are very, very heavy. So if you have a message for them, we would love to be able to amplify that.
Mm-hmm. No, that's beautiful. I love our allies. Allies seem to be everywhere, and are amazing, particularly when they're a parent or a relative of a trans person. The amount of power in the voice of an ally, when they are committed to taking care of their loved one, taking care of their kid, that's going to overcome whatever our governments and parliaments and so forth ever attempt to do. And so I would just say to allies, come along, go along, keep doing all that you're doing. For those who want to understand and learn more, there's a lot of information that's been written. I've just, described a very useful book to learn about this experience. There are lots of podcasts. I've been on about 15 or 20 of them at this point in the last several months, where we talk about these things from different perspectives. With regard to individuals, particularly young people, don't lose connection, don't lose hope. Find safe places. It may not be in your own family, it may be in amongst your chosen family. I'm aware that teachers and educators can often be safe people. I'm not sure how many safe people there are at church anymore, but there may be one there too, particularly amongst our allies who are willing to let people know that they're safe. I knew when I was telling my story for the first time in my ward, I told my bishop, I said, someone else in the ward needs to hear this. And lo and behold, a 14-year-old in our ward who nobody knew why they were struggling and withdrawn came to the bishop and said, is it okay if I talk with Laurie? Because this is me too. And over the next couple of years, talking with this non-binary person who I had to figure out how to understand where they were coming from. When I eventually moved from the area, that young person told me that our conversations, which were somewhat infrequent, and we were separated by 40 years or more in age, those conversations that we had had during that difficult time had saved their life.
Yeah.
And so if you're a young person and you can latch on to somebody who you can talk to, particularly when things seem kind of cold and dark, just hang on, find ways to hang on to each other and support each other and be together, stay strong, stay safe, and stay together.
I love those words.
Beautiful.
Really
Thank
powerful.
you so much. Laurie Lee, we love you. Thank you so much for being part of our experience. I feel like we know you because your journey has been part of the milieu. You have inspired so many of us, and it has been such a pleasure to feel inspired by you and to hear these messages of hope. So thank you so much. We wish you the very best of luck with your continuing journey as you're speaking about your book and sharing your experiences. We congratulate you on your Brodie Award. We are so proud. And with that, friends, we're going to be back. We hope next week we should be doing some training with you all.
We are going to do
it's, let me tell you, it's going to blow your mind.
It's
You're going to
be
find this extremely useful. Yeah, you're going to want to share this with your ward councils. So let me just do a shout out for that. We'll share all the news about it soon. We're going to put a link to where you can get your copy of Dictates of Conscience here in the UK, we'll post it. We're not as expert about the US, but we'll do our best, and we'll try to find out which bookstores. Hopefully, the LDS bookstore, based down in Chorley, will get some copies of this, and that would be spectacular. They have been edgy before, and if there is a lot of requests. Okay, so do you hear me? You'll want to call the bookstore, ask them to get the book in, and then we can support local businesses. Everyone wins. Buy one for the person in your life who needs to read it too. So yes, this is a must read. Thanks everyone. We will see you again. Sarah, do you have a message before we head?
Just before we go, just one really quick message for Laurie Lee talked about the importance of being able to be a safe person, finding somebody safe to talk to, being able to be that safe person. Sometimes something as simple as a wristband, an LGBT trans-friendly pin, a badge, wristband, can just be enough to let people in your ward know that you're a safe person. And I have certainly had somebody come up to me and talk to me and say, "Seen your wristband?" I said, "Yeah." And we've been able to have a conversation about being gay in the church. And that's really important. So even something as simple as that might spark a conversation that you are a safe person for somebody else in your ward or your community. So just something little maybe we could all do.
Absolutely. What I would also suggest actually on that, expect lots of protests across the UK over the next while in solidarity with trans rights. You people in America, you may not know this, but anytime action is taken that targets marginalised groups, there across the United Kingdom, there are sister demonstrations and support. So look out for your nearest one, a city near you. There should be something coming up this weekend. So just keep your eyes peeled on social media. If you want to show your interest and support, there are lots of ways you can do that. But yeah, just be a good human and go buy the book. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. We'll see you all next week. We bless your journey.
Nice.